Nathan Cole never expected his dream vacation to start with a nightmare. He had done everything right. Booked first-class tickets, saved for years, followed every rule. But the moment he and his family set foot in Riverside International Airport, they were treated as if they didn't belong. Dismissed at check-in, questioned at boarding, humiliated in front of an entire cabin. The message was clear. People like them weren't supposed to experience luxury. His wife, Emily, held her head high, but Nathan noticed the way her fingers trembled as she rested them on their daughter's shoulders. His 10-year-old son, Ethan, sat silently, staring at his shoes, not out of boredom, but out of shame. And the worst part? No one cared. The flight attendants sneered, the passengers looked away, and the whispers grew louder than the roar of the engines. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have predicted, was that someone was watching. Someone with power. Someone who wouldn't let this slide. By the time this plane landed, their world would never be the same. Nathan adjusted the worn strap of his duffel bag as he stepped into the check-in line with Emily and their two children, Sophia and Ethan. It was supposed to be a day of excitement, their first time flying first class, a long overdue family trip they had worked years to afford. But from the moment they arrived, something felt off. Several check-in counters stood open, yet no one called them forward. They had been standing there for nearly 20 minutes, while passengers behind them were helped immediately. "Excuse me?" Nathan said politely, raising a hand. The airline employee, a blonde woman with a sharp uniform and a name tag that read Madison, barely glanced at him before turning her attention to a well-dressed couple approaching the counter. "Welcome, sir, ma'am." She greeted them with a bright smile, scanning their tickets without hesitation. Nathan exhaled slowly, tightening his grip on Sophia's hand. Emily, standing beside him, frowned. "They're ignoring us," she murmured. "I see it," Nathan replied, keeping his voice low for the kids' sake. The line dwindled, yet every time their turn came, the agents at the counter suddenly found something else to do, typing furiously, making a call, whispering to a coworker. Other passengers breezed through check-in in seconds, but for the Coles, it was as if they were invisible. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes, Madison sighed dramatically and gestured them forward. "Next." Nathan stepped up, handing over their tickets. Madison took them with the enthusiasm of someone handling a piece of trash. Her eyes flicked over their names before she began tapping at her keyboard, lips pressing together in something that almost resembled disapproval. "One moment," she muttered. Emily crossed her arms. "Is something wrong?" "No," Madison replied curtly, still typing. Then, with a voice laced with forced politeness, she added, "I just need to verify some things." Nathan exchanged a look with Emily, the unease in his stomach growing heavier. Sophia, only 7, tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, why do we have to wait so long?" He forced a smile. "No reason, sweetheart. Just a little mix-up." After several agonizing minutes, Madison finally slid their boarding passes across the counter. "There you go." Nathan reached for them, but she didn't let go immediately. Instead, she looked at him, then down at his faded jeans and slightly worn sneakers. "First class?" she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes," Emily said firmly, taking the tickets from her grip. "We booked them months ago." Madison simply hummed in response as if she didn't quite believe it, then turned away before they could say anything else. Relieved to be past the first hurdle, the Coles made their way towards security. But just as they were about to step forward, another airline worker, a man in his 40s named Greg, jogged toward them. "Mr. Cole?" Nathan turned. "Yes?" Greg forced a smile. "I'm so sorry, but there's been a small issue with your luggage." Nathan tensed. "What kind of issue?" Greg rubbed the back of his neck. "It looks like your checked bags were mistakenly routed to the wrong destination. We're working on retrieving them, but for now, we can only—" Greg's expression remained neutral as he continued. "We estimate your luggage will be delivered within 24 to 48 hours. Emily's eyes widened. "So we won't have our bags for the trip?" "I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience," Greg said, though his tone lacked genuine remorse. Nathan inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. "What about our carry-ons?" Greg motioned toward the small duffel bag slung over Nathan's shoulder. "That's all you've got, right?" Nathan's jaw tightened. The kids' extra clothes were in the missing suitcases. Emily had packed all their essentials inside. Even his blazer, the only formal piece of clothing he owned, was gone. Greg barely glanced at him before adding, "These things happen. You'll get your bags eventually. Until then, you can always pick up whatever you need when you land." Nathan's fingers curled into his palm. "Buy what we need?" Did they think money came easily to them? This trip had already stretched their budget thin. Every dollar had been carefully planned. Emily placed a hand on his arm before he could speak. "We'll manage," she said softly. It wasn't worth making a scene. Not yet. Greg gave a half-hearted smile before walking away, leaving them standing there, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Nathan readjusted his grip on Sophia's tiny hand and exchanged a glance with his wife. Emily squeezed his fingers. "It's fine. We still have the trip ahead of us." He nodded, but a bitter thought crept into his mind. If they were treating them like this already, what would happen once they stepped on the plane? As they neared the boarding gate, Nathan tried to shake the uneasy feeling, but it clung to him like a bad omen. Emily was silent beside him, her expression tense, clearly thinking the same thing. Ahead, a flight attendant stood near the gate, chatting with a coworker. Her navy uniform was crisp, her blonde ponytail perfectly tied, her name tag reading Vanessa Hale. Her expression was unreadable, until her gaze landed on them. For a brief moment her polite smile flickered. Then it vanished entirely. She exchanged a quick glance with her coworker before picking up the microphone. "Attention passengers," she announced, her voice carrying over the low murmur of the crowd. "Before we continue boarding, we need to verify some ticketing issues. If you have a first-class seat, please have your boarding pass ready." Nathan frowned. That was odd. The line had been moving smoothly. No one ahead of them had been asked to verify anything. Vanessa's eyes flicked back toward them. "Let's start with you," she said, waving them forward. Emily stiffened. "Is there a problem?" Vanessa's smile was thin. "Just a routine check." "Routine check. Right." Nathan handed over their tickets, his jaw tight, as Vanessa took her time inspecting them. She flipped them over slowly, as if she were deciphering some hidden code. She tilted her head. "First class, huh?" Her tone dripped with doubt. Nathan kept his voice steady. "That's what the ticket says." Vanessa didn't move. Behind them, the line was growing restless. Passengers murmured in frustration. A businessman in a sleek gray suit sighed audibly, shifting his weight impatiently. A younger flight attendant, a brunette named Jenna, stepped forward. "Vanessa, everything looks fine." Vanessa cut her off. "I'd like to double-check with the system." Jenna hesitated, then gave a small nod and stepped back. Nathan exhaled slowly, biting his tongue as Vanessa typed, unnecessarily long, into her tablet. Sophia shifted beside him, her tiny fingers gripping his wrist. "Daddy," she whispered. "It's okay, baby," he murmured, squeezing her hand. After a painfully long pause, Vanessa finally sighed and handed back their tickets. "All right, you're clear. No apology, no explanation. Just dismissal." Nathan took the boarding passes and stepped forward, relieved to move past this ridiculous delay. But then Vanessa's voice rang out again. "Oh, one more thing." He turned, barely masking his irritation. "Yes? I need you to remove your shoes." Emily inhaled sharply. "What?" Vanessa crossed her arms. "Security procedure." Nathan's expression remained blank, but his voice was flat. "That's funny. We already cleared security." Vanessa shrugged. "Sometimes additional checks are required." Nathan glanced behind him. No one else was being stopped. No one else was being asked to remove their shoes in the middle of the boarding area. The humiliation of it burned through him. But then he saw Sophia watching. Her big brown eyes filled with confusion. He wouldn't let her see him break. Without a word, he bent down and untied his sneakers. Nathan bent down and untied his sneakers, stepping out of them and setting them aside without a word. Emily hesitated before following his lead, her hands unsteady as she slipped off her flats. Vanessa folded her arms, her expression smug. Nathan clenched his jaw. "Do you want the kids to do it too?" Vanessa gave an exaggerated blink, pretending to think it over. "That won't be necessary," she finally said, her tone sickeningly sweet. Nathan slid his shoes back on with a practiced calm, though his fingers twitched. Emily did the same, though he could see her hands were shaking slightly. Vanessa stepped aside with a satisfied smile. "Enjoy your flight." Nathan took Emily's hand and led their children past the gate. As soon as they stepped onto the jet bridge, Emily let out a shaky breath. They wanted to humiliate us, she whispered. Nathan didn't respond. He didn't have to. They both knew the truth. He guided his family onto the plane, forcing himself to stay calm, to push past the lingering humiliation. Emily was tense beside him, her fingers twitching as she adjusted Sophia's tiny backpack. But they had made it. Now they just needed to settle in, breathe, and move forward. At least, that's what Nathan told himself. Until they reached their seats. Row 2A and 2B. First class. Plush, spacious seating, extra legroom. At least that's what the website had promised. But something was off. Nathan stopped beside their assigned seats, his brow furrowing. The seat cushions looked oddly compressed, almost deflated. The recline button on his chair was missing entirely. And then, like a shadow creeping up behind him, Vanessa materialized. "Ah, you must be the Coles," she said, her tone dripping with false warmth. Nathan exhaled sharply. "Yes." Vanessa made a show of glancing at her clipboard, clicking her tongue. "Oh dear. Seems like there's been a little issue with your seats." Emily stiffened. "What kind of issue?" Vanessa sighed dramatically. "Well, it appears that 2A's seat mechanism is broken, won't recline properly, and 2B has some padding issues, but I'm sure it's still comfortable enough for you." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Are there any other seats available?" Vanessa's smile widened. "First class is full." Nathan held her gaze. He had counted at least 3 empty seats when they boarded. But before he could argue, a businessman in seat 3A, a balding man in an expensive suit, cleared his throat loudly. He gave Nathan a pointed look, as if telling him to drop it. Emily touched his arm. "Let's just sit," she murmured. Nathan lowered himself into the stiff, uneven seat, immediately feeling the discomfort as the broken mechanism dug into his back. Emily sat beside him, shifting uncomfortably. Sophia curled up on Emily's lap, hugging her stuffed bunny close. Vanessa leaned in. "I'd hate for you to be uncomfortable, but I suppose you're used to that, right?" Nathan turned his head slowly. "Excuse me?" Vanessa blinked innocently. "Well, you know, some people are more accustomed to luxury than others. It's an adjustment." Nathan's fingers curled into fists. The heat in his chest rose sharply, the familiar prickle of anger creeping up his spine. He wanted to say something, to push back, to demand the respect his family deserved. But then Ethan, his 10-year-old son, looked up at him, his wide eyes filled with worry. Nathan exhaled slowly, unclenched his fists. "We'll manage," he said, his voice steady. Vanessa straightened, clearly pleased with herself, and turned to walk away. 5 minutes later, the temperature in the cabin began to drop. Emily shivered, rubbing Sophia's arms to keep her warm. Nathan glanced around. Other first-class passengers were wrapped in thick, plush blankets. He flagged down a passing flight attendant. Not Vanessa this time. This one was Daniel Tate, a tall man with neatly combed hair and the forced politeness of someone who had already decided not to care. "Excuse me, can we get a blanket for the kids?" Nathan asked. Daniel barely looked at him. "We're out." Nathan frowned. "Out? But I just saw you hand one to the woman in 4C. Daniel glanced over his shoulder, then shrugged. "She requested earlier." Nathan's jaw tightened. "So did we." Daniel sighed, tapping his pen against his notepad. "Look, sir, there are limited supplies. We prioritize passengers based on need." Nathan stared at him. "And my kids don't need one?" Daniel smirked slightly. "I mean, they're young. They'll be fine." Emily tightened her grip on Sophia, her expression unreadable. Nathan had seen her swallow her pride before, but this time he could see the cracks forming. Nathan exhaled sharply. "You're seriously telling me there's nothing left?" Daniel's smirk widened. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "But hey, I'm sure you've handled worse, right?" Nathan's fists curled again. He could feel the eyes on him. The entire first-class cabin was watching. Waiting to see if he would snap. Waiting to see if he would prove their unspoken assumptions right. Nathan took a slow breath. "We're fine." Daniel straightened, clearly satisfied, and walked away. It wasn't just them who had noticed how cold it was. Other passengers, wrapped in thick blankets, sat comfortably, barely acknowledging the difference. The Coles, however, had been dismissed entirely. Nathan exhaled, trying to control the frustration building inside him. He refused to let them break him. A few minutes later, Daniel strolled back through first class, a small bottle of cologne in hand. He sprayed a light mist near a row of passengers, flashing an easy smile as he made small talk. Then, as he reached 2A and 2B, he stopped. With deliberate movements, he aimed the bottle directly at Nathan and Emily, releasing 3 sharp sprays into the air. A thick scent of citrus and musk hit Nathan's nose. Emily coughed, turning her head away as the overpowering fragrance burned her senses. Daniel smirked, shaking the bottle slightly as if inspecting how much was left. "Just freshening up the cabin," he said lightly, not even trying to hide his amusement. Nathan's jaw clenched. "You didn't do that anywhere else." Daniel raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Did I not? Huh. Guess I missed a spot here." Emily gripped Nathan's arm, her fingers pressing firmly against his skin. A silent plea. "Don't react. Not yet." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his small frame rigid, the tension in the air suffocating. Daniel took one last smug look at them before strolling back toward the galley. From a few rows ahead, Vanessa smirked and leaned toward another flight attendant, whispering something that made them both chuckle. Nathan forced himself to breathe. He could handle the humiliation, but watching his wife and children endure it, that was different. Minutes later, Vanessa picked up the cabin microphone. She cleared her throat, her voice saccharine and smooth as it carried through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our in-flight service, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for choosing Northern Skies Airlines today. We take great pride in our commitment to inclusivity and our dedication to providing opportunities for all travelers, regardless of background or financial status." Nathan's grip tightened around the armrest. Vanessa continued, her tone filled with artificial warmth. "It's truly heartwarming to see our first-class cabin open its doors to guests from all walks of life. Travel should be accessible to everyone, no matter their circumstances. So let's all celebrate the fact that luxury doesn't have to be reserved for just the elite." A few passengers turned their heads toward Nathan's row. In 3A, the same businessman from earlier smirked and shook his head as he sipped his champagne. Vanessa's gaze flicked to Nathan, amusement flickering across her face as she set the microphone down. Nathan kept his expression blank, but inside, something burned. It wasn't just what she said. It was the way she said it. She had turned their presence into a spectacle, twisting an ordinary flight into something meant to remind them, and everyone else, exactly who didn't belong. Emily exhaled shakily, turning toward Nathan. "She did that on purpose." "I know." Ethan lowered his head, staring at his lap. His voice came out quiet, hesitant. "Are we poor?" Nathan's stomach twisted painfully. "No." "Then why did she say that?" Nathan didn't answer. Instead, his gaze drifted toward Vanessa, who had already moved on, laughing with a wealthy-looking woman in seat 1C. Sophia had dozed off against Emily, shivering slightly in the cold. Ethan sat with his arms crossed, staring blankly at the seat back in front of him. Refusing to meet his father's eyes, the silence between them felt heavy. Then the scent of fresh food filled the cabin. Flight attendants moved down the aisle with meal carts, placing rich plates of salmon, roasted potatoes, and warm bread in front of the first-class passengers. Glasses of fine wine clinked softly. Nathan's stomach twisted, not just with hunger, but with the sharp sting of being ignored. Vanessa and Daniel moved effortlessly through the rows, placing meals in front of each passenger. They exchanged pleasantries, refilled drinks, smiled warmly at the others. When they reached 2A and 2B, they skipped right over them. Nathan clenched his fists under the tray table. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The flight attendants returned to check on the other passengers, topping off drinks, clearing plates, offering fresh cups of coffee. Still, nothing for them. Ethan swallowed hard. His voice was dull, empty. "I guess we don't get to eat." Nathan's chest tightened. "They'll bring us something." Emily rubbed her arms, silent, but Nathan wasn't sure he believed his own words. Emily rubbed her arms, her lips pressed together in silence. Another 10 minutes passed before Vanessa finally sauntered toward them, 2 trays in her hands. She set them down with a loud clatter, the silverware rattling against the plastic. The food looked unappetizing, cold, congealed, as if it had been left out far too long. The bread roll was stiff, the butter untouched and unmelted. Vanessa smiled, tilting her head slightly. "Hope you don't mind. We had to, you know. Prioritize service for our frequent flyers first." She gestured vaguely down the aisle. Nathan didn't move. Emily hesitated, then picked up her fork, poking at the rubbery salmon. Ethan prodded his food with his knife, then pushed his plate away. "I'm not hungry." Vanessa smirked and turned on her heel, strolling away without another word. Nathan exhaled slowly through his nose. "Eat, Ethan." Ethan clenched his fists. "Why? So we can pretend like everything's fine?" Nathan had no answer. Minutes later, the attendants returned to clear the trays. Daniel stopped beside Nathan's seat, holding a large black trash bag. "All right, folks, let's clean up." Vanessa approached from the other side, carrying another bag. But instead of reaching for their trays, she dropped the bag directly into Nathan's lap. The greasy smell of half-eaten food and crumpled napkins hit him immediately. Vanessa tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "Do you mind taking care of this? Since you're already sitting there, might as well make yourself useful." Nathan's hands locked around the bag, the plastic crinkling beneath his grip. Emily stiffened beside him. Ethan's face burned red. Vanessa tapped her foot, waiting. Nathan's fingers twitched. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Slowly, he stood. The entire first-class cabin fell silent. Forks scraped against plates as eyes turned toward them. Without a word, Nathan walked past Vanessa and dropped the trash bag onto the floor at her feet. Vanessa's smirk faltered. Nathan met her gaze. "Oops," he said flatly. For the first time, she looked genuinely surprised. But then, she laughed, shaking her head. "No need to be dramatic." She kicked the bag aside. "I was just trying to help you feel comfortable. You seem like the hands-on type." Daniel snorted. The businessman in 3A chuckled behind his glass of whiskey. Nathan turned and sat back down. Ethan whispered, "I hate this." The humiliation lingered in the air, but Nathan forced himself to stay steady. Then came the next blow. A man in 3C, dressed in an expensive navy suit, waved down Vanessa. His voice was smooth, calculated. "I'd prefer to sit by the window." Vanessa's lips curled. "Of course, sir. Let me see what I can do." Nathan already knew what was coming. Vanessa strolled toward him, placing a perfectly manicured hand on the headrest of his seat. "Mr. Cole," she said, voice dripping with false politeness, "I'm going to need you and your family to swap seats." Nathan's hands locked around the armrests. "Our seats are assigned. We're not moving." Vanessa's smile didn't falter. "First class is about making passengers feel comfortable, and Mr. Graham here has been flying with us for years. It's just a small favor." Nathan didn't move. Vanessa leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough for only him to hear. "It's either you switch seats, or I can always call security and have you moved." Emily's grip on Sophia tightened. Ethan's head sank lower. Nathan swallowed hard. Then stiffly, he nodded. "Fine." Vanessa beamed. "That's the spirit." They were shuffled to the last row of first class, right next to the galley. The flight attendants bustled back and forth, bumping into their seats every few minutes. The noise, the movement, it was impossible to get comfortable. Sophia stirred, whimpering. "Mommy, I need to go potty." Emily brushed her daughter's curls, unbuckling her seatbelt. "Okay, sweetheart, let's go." She stood leading Sophia toward the restroom at the front of the cabin. But before they could reach it, Vanessa stepped in their path. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, arms crossed. Emily blinked. "The restroom." Vanessa shook her head. "First-class restrooms are reserved for priority passengers." Nathan sat up straighter, his muscles tensing. "We are first-class passengers." Vanessa barely spared him a glance. "Like I said, priority passengers." She gestured toward the back. "The economy restroom is that way. Feel free to use that one." Sophia gripped Emily's hand tighter, her little body trembling. "Mommy, I can't hold it." Emily gritted her teeth. "She's 7. Vanessa shrugged. Sophia's breath hitched. "Mommy, please." Nathan's hands curled into fists. Nathan started to rise, his patience worn thin, but Emily placed a firm hand on his chest, shaking her head slightly. "Not yet." Instead, she turned to Vanessa, her voice eerily calm. "Move." Vanessa sighed dramatically, stepping aside at the very last second, ensuring Emily had no choice but to brush against her as she passed. Nathan watched his wife and daughter disappear into the restroom, his pulse hammering in his ears. Beside him, Ethan sat rigid, his voice barely a whisper. "I hate this." Nathan looked at his son. Ethan's shoulders were curled inward, his fingers digging into his jeans. He didn't look angry, he looked ashamed. But Vanessa wasn't finished. She strolled past their row, a cup of water in hand. Then, with a casual flick of her wrist, she spilled it onto the floor near their feet. Ice scattered, melting into a small puddle. Vanessa gasped dramatically, loud enough for passengers up front to turn their heads. "Oh no, someone made a mess." She placed a hand on her hip, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Cole, was this you?" Nathan's jaw locked. Emily straightened. "You just—" Vanessa raised a hand, cutting her off. "I mean, we can't have spills in first class. It's a safety hazard. If you can't keep your area clean, maybe it's best that you sit somewhere easier to manage." Nathan's grip on the armrest tightened. Ethan tensed beside him, his fists clenched. A murmur rippled through the cabin, passengers glancing their way, some shaking their heads. Vanessa tapped her finger against her lips, pretending to think. Then, with a snap of her fingers, she signaled to Daniel. "Daniel, we should move them. We can't have them disturbing our priority guests." Daniel smirked. "Where to?" Vanessa tilted her head toward the galley. "Back there, by the service area. Should be quiet enough." Nathan stood abruptly, the chair creaking beneath him. "Sir!" Daniel raised a hand, his expression falsely concerned. "If you don't cooperate, we'll have to report this." Ethan stared up at his father, eyes desperate, pleading. Nathan saw it then, the fear, the shame, the way his son wished he could disappear. Nathan let out a slow, measured breath. "Fine." Vanessa clapped her hands together, beaming. "Wonderful. Right this way." They were forced to stand and move down the aisle, past rows of watching eyes. Some passengers looked away, embarrassed. Others judged them silently. The murmurs followed them like ghosts. At the back of first class, next to the galley, the cramped jump seats were folded against the wall, the kind meant for flight attendants during takeoff, not paying passengers. Vanessa pointed. "Make yourselves comfortable." Sophia whimpered, gripping Emily's sleeve. Nathan sat first, the stiff seat pressing painfully into his back. Emily settled beside him, cradling Sophia. Ethan hesitated, his face twisted with humiliation. "Sit, Ethan," Nathan said quietly. The boy lowered himself onto the hard seat, head ducked. Vanessa leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "See? Much better. Now everyone can relax." A small chuckle came from the front. The businessman in 3A smirked, sipping his drink. Vanessa, clearly pleased with herself, sauntered back toward the main cabin. Nathan sat still, staring ahead. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Ethan didn't speak. Sophia buried her face in Emily's shoulder. Nathan's back ached from the rigid seat, the humiliation settling deep in his chest, pressing against his ribs like a weight he couldn't shake. Then, from the last row of first class, a man stood, tall, silver-haired, his movements precise, unhurried. Martin Holloway had been silent the entire flight, a passive observer. But now his presence filled the cabin like a gathering storm. Vanessa barely noticed at first, still reveling in her small victory. Daniel nudged her, muttering something under his breath. But when Martin stepped into the aisle, the energy shifted. The businessman in 3A, who had laughed earlier, suddenly tensed. Martin reached into his suit pocket, pulled out his phone and pressed a single button, lifting it to his ear, his voice, smooth, controlled. Cut through the air. "Russell, it's me." Vanessa's breath hitched. Martin continued, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "I'm on flight 739, and we have a problem." He paused, his gaze flicking toward Vanessa. Martin let out a low chuckle. "No, Russell," he said smoothly. "It's worse than that. Your crew just made the worst mistake of their careers." Vanessa stiffened. Daniel's fingers tightened around his tray. Martin shook his head slightly. "I want this plane grounded the second we land. Get your people ready. And Russell, make sure they understand exactly who they just messed with." Vanessa took a shaky step forward, forcing a polite smile. "Sir, is there something I can assist you with?" Martin didn't even look at her. "Yeah," he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Tell security to wait at the gate." Vanessa's face went pale. Passengers exchanged frantic glances. The shift in power was undeniable. Martin turned, his sharp blue eyes locking on to Nathan for the first time. Then, with deliberate steps, he walked forward and extended a hand. "Get up." Nathan hesitated. The entire cabin was watching. The ones who had laughed at him, the ones who had ignored him, the ones who had pretended none of this was happening. Martin's voice remained steady. "You've sat in filth long enough." Vanessa went rigid. Daniel took a step back. Nathan slowly reached out, gripping Martin's hand. His muscles ached, but as he stood, something else took over. The The weight of shame began to lift. Passengers whispered frantically. The shift in power was undeniable. Someone with real authority had spoken, and it wasn't Vanessa. Martin turned to face her. "I'll see you on the ground." Vanessa couldn't breathe. Daniel went stiff. For the first time all flight, Nathan Cole wasn't the one people were staring at. The storm had arrived. Vanessa sat frozen, her mind racing, as the plane began its descent. The once light-hearted cabin had turned eerily silent. Every passenger knew something big was happening. The weight of Martin Holloway's phone call hung in the air, a warning that the balance of power had shifted permanently. Nathan sat taller now, his hands no longer clenched. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't the one in trouble. The landing gear deployed, and a ripple of tension spread through the first-class cabin. Vanessa gripped the back of a seat, her knuckles white. Daniel fidgeted beside her, his eyes darting toward the cockpit. As the plane touched down, Vanessa swallowed hard. Then she saw them. Through the small window, standing on the private runway, was Russell Grayson, CEO of Northern Skies Airlines. He wasn't alone. 5 security officers flanked him, their expressions unreadable. Vanessa's breath came short. Daniel whispered, "We're screwed." The plane rolled to a stop. The moment the doors opened, Martin was the first to step out. He didn't need to announce himself. Russell's entire demeanor shifted the second he saw him. "Martin," Russell greeted, his voice calm but carrying a dangerous edge. Martin adjusted his cufflinks, giving a small nod. "We need to talk." Russell's gaze flickered behind him, landing on Vanessa. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. "Out," Russell ordered. Vanessa hesitated. But the security officers moved forward. She had no choice. She stepped onto the jet bridge, her stomach twisting. Nathan and his family remained seated. No one had told them to leave. Vanessa walked down the steps, each movement heavier than the last. The passengers who had once smirked alongside her now avoided her gaze. She came to a halt before Russell, forcing a tight smile. "Sir, I can explain." The slap came so fast, she didn't even see it coming. A sharp crack echoed through the air as Russell's palm collided with her cheek, snapping her head to the side. A collective gasp came from nearby crew members. Vanessa staggered, her ears rang, her face burned. Russell's voice was low and lethal. "You just cost me everything." Vanessa's vision blurred. Russell stepped closer. "Did you think no one would notice? That humiliating a paying customer in front of an entire first-class cabin wouldn't get back to me?" Vanessa opened her mouth, but no words came. Russell's cold stare burned into her. "Get off my runway." 2 security officers grabbed her arms. Passengers watched from the windows as Vanessa was dragged away. Her once perfect uniform, now wrinkled. Her carefully curated persona shattered in an instant. Daniel tried to slip away unnoticed, but Martin turned to him too. Daniel froze mid-step. 2 more guards moved in. His protests were ignored as he was yanked down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, Ethan peered toward the window. "Are they arresting them?" Nathan let out a slow breath. "Something like that." Ethan peered toward the window. "Are they arresting him?" Nathan let out a slow breath. "Something like that." Emily, still holding Sophia, finally allowed herself to relax. Vanessa's footsteps scraped against the tarmac, her wrists locked in the unforgiving grip of the security officers. Daniel struggled beside her, muttering frantic excuses. But no one was listening. The moment they crossed into the terminal, they were escorted straight through a set of double doors. Their careers were over before they even understood what hit them. Russell turned back to Martin, exhaling sharply. "You were right," he muttered. "This was bad." Martin smirked. "You have no idea." The CEO straightened his jacket before stepping toward the plane. Nathan and his family were still seated, watching the chaos unfold. Passengers stole glances at them, some suddenly too ashamed to make eye contact. Russell stopped at Nathan's row. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice measured, "I owe you an apology." Nathan held his gaze. "That won't change what happened," Russell nodded. "No, it won't, but this might help." He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and signed his name with a single, fluid motion. Tearing it out, he extended it toward Nathan. Nathan hesitated, then took it. $1 million. Emily gasped softly, her fingers tightening around Sophia. Russell's expression remained firm. "This isn't just about you," he said. "It's about making sure this never happens again. This airline will implement mandatory anti-discrimination training, restructure our policies, and hold every employee accountable, starting today." Nathan glanced at the check, then at his children. He wasn't just taking this for himself. He was taking it for them. Russell stepped back, looking at his watch. "A car is waiting outside to take you wherever you need to go." His gaze softened, just slightly. "I hope you still enjoy your trip." Emily wiped at the corner of her eye. "Thank you." Martin clapped a hand on Nathan's shoulder. "Next time you fly with me." Nathan managed a small, genuine smile. "I'll hold you to that." As they stepped off the plane, the weight they had carried since takeoff was gone. No more whispers, no more humiliation, just the open air, and a future that, for the first time in a long time, felt different. And Vanessa? She never worked in aviation again. The end. Justice had been served. The Cole family not only received an apology, but also $1 million compensation and a commitment to systemic change. Vanessa and Daniel lost their careers instantly, because no one escapes the consequences of discrimination. What do you think about this punishment? Comment your thoughts and where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so this never happens again.